Hey everyone, Christ is risen, and blessed days of the Feast of Mid-Pentecost. My reflection today I've entitled The COVID Baby Bust. You know, one of the hopes to redeem this horrible year of COVID chaos, confinement, and huddling in our homes is that maybe families have been able to draw near together, and husbands and wives to be able to be close and not tyrannized by busy schedules. And a hope that maybe also that children could be conceived, and our ever-declining fertility rate in our nation might increase. I think many people hope this, but in fact, it was a bust. It was a bust. Stats have come out about fertility rates over the COVID lockdown, and what do you know? They went down. In fact, the fertility rate for 2020 was the lowest in recorded history. The United States started recording fertility rates in 1930. We started tracking them in the 1930s. And these are the lowest rates ever. How sad and how grievous that our hopes were dashed. Our hopes were dashed. I want to reflect on this and comment a little bit about what it means for a culture to have a declining fertility rate, especially for such a catastrophic decline as we've seen over COVID. And of course, it's not just the fact that the fertility rates are plummeting. It's not just that families, husbands and wives, decided not to have children, but it's also that we're not replacing ourselves. It's a eclipse of vision, and it also coincides with the secular glorification of childlessness. In fact, on Mother's Day, the New York Times ran articles about women who were happy not to be mothers and were glad that they weren't mothers. Well, thanks a lot. What a contribution to Mother's Day that must have been. Having a vision for childbearing is something that we Christians, we believers, have deep in our hearts and can offer to the world to help infuse a child-oriented, a family-centered, loving vision for life. You know, childbearing is about the blessing of God. The blessing of God. There's a reason that the scriptures consider barrenness to be a great sadness. There's a beautiful psalm. It's the 112th psalm in the Septuagint, Psalm 113, if you're reading the Psalter outside of the Septuagint, where the psalmist says that God's blessing takes the pauper out of the dust. It raises the pauper out of the dust, and it establishes a mother in her home, making her a joyous mother of children. This is the sign of God's blessing. When the psalmist thought, what does God's blessing look like? It looks like a woman in her home, filled with joy in the presence of her children. This is God's tangible blessing. And those, of course, who love God and have children know this to be the case, that it's incomparable in so many ways to be able to have children and to love them and to raise them. It's all about God's blessing. And so when we see a culture saying no to childbearing, what we see is the turning away of God's blessing, the loss of God's blessing. Childbearing is also about God's command. You know, procreation is something that God's invested in. He himself spoke these words, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, rule it, and subdue it. He spoke these words to Adam. In fact, these words, this was the first command that ever went into a human ear. The command to multiply God's image on the earth. This is a very fundamental aspect of our calling. Having children is not just something that we choose to do or not based upon our own individualistic interests. Having children is about God's interests. It's about God's commands. Of course, this is in direct opposition to the sexual revolution's concepts of childbearing, but those are Johnny-come-lately ideas, and they've produced torrential sorrow. For us, childbearing is about God's blessing. Childbearing is about God's commandment. Childbearing is also about the mission of the church. The church can never be strong if children are not embraced. The church can never accomplish its task in the world if we don't love and cherish humanity, if we don't love and cherish God's image, and especially the children that he chooses to give to his children in marriage. St. Ambrose of Milan, the magnificent 4th century church father, he said there's two ways that the church prospers and grows and fulfills the Great Commission to make disciples of all the nations. He says the first is by catechizing adults and baptizing them, receiving them into the faith. So the preaching of the gospel and the reception of converts. And the second is by Christian families embracing their call to bear the children that God intends to give them in his wise discernment and raise them for Christ as athletes for Christ. And he says, and of the two, the second is more successful. Can you imagine? He in no way is denigrating the power of preaching, but he's pointing out the simple fact that if you preach and you win a pagan, or in our days, a secularist to the church, may that happen more and more, you have quite the catechetical task to unwind their way of life, which isn't based upon a foundation of love for God and man, and to rewind it to form them in Christ-like living. When you have a child and you bring them to Christ into the baptismal font as an infant, you have the whole course of their upbringing to teach them in a very tangible way by your way of life and by your words, to teach them, to raise them in the church and in your family home to be holy gods. And 18 years of discipleship in the home with loving parents is an incredible foundation for serving God in the world and promoting the cause of the church. So this is another reason that we believers are so oriented towards child rearing. It's not just that it's a great blessing for us, it is, and that it's God's command, which it most certainly is. It's also very central to the mission of the church. We can't accomplish our tasks. This means when Christian people refuse childbearing and the incredible task of parenting, the church is weak. The church is weak. Strong churches are churches full of children. And a fourth fundamental conviction about childbearing that makes it so precious to us is that childbearing is all about the path of salvation. It's all about being saved. Yes. It's not just about having someone to spend time with or fulfilling a vision of mature life. It's about our salvation, the salvation of the parents. St. Paul, for instance, in his first epistle to his spiritual son Timothy, in chapter 2, at the end of chapter 2, he says, women will be saved through bearing children if they continue in faith and sanctity with self-restraint. His idea is that the process of parenting is salvific. It actually is a context for father and mother and children to children and grandparents, I've learned. It's a context for dying to self. It's a context for escaping self-love and self-esteem and to develop love for God and for others, which is, in the Christian vision, the very essence of what it means to grow spiritually, to pursue a life of salvation. Parenting, raising children is the way that God has ordained for many to die to self. And make no mistake, there is no salvation without dying to self. It's the very first thing that Jesus said for those who wanted to follow him. If you wish to come after me, deny yourself. Take up your cross and follow me. And the Lord has fashioned parenting such that this parental love in conceiving a child and supporting the child in the womb and then welcoming this child into your family home and into the parish is so infused with emotion of love, emotion and love, that it aids the process of self-denial. It's God's work to provide a context for us to become Christ-like. So if we want to be saved, we really need to have this mentality about children and childbirth. And it's through these four lenses that any Christian should read an article about the COVID baby bust. It's not just that sad that our culture is declining. That's a comment. The birth rate is a commentary on the vision of a culture. And our culture is dying. We're only maintaining population now by immigration. Much more importantly, it is a commentary upon a lack of religious vision. It's a commentary upon a lack of faith, a lack of confidence in God, a lack of potency in Christianity in our culture. Childbearing is everything about our relationship with God and understanding His blessing, understanding His commands, understanding the cause and the purposes of the church on the earth, and in working out our own salvation. So I'm encouraging all of you to reject the promotion of radical feminism and our post-sexual revolution culture, which tells you that family life is not that important, children are not that important, that you need to live your own life. You need to be you, which means don't have children, as though having children is not living your life, and the very context in which the true you can actually arise. Reject that. All of our professional ambitions are not a substitute for the development of our spiritual lives and marriage and family life. In fact, commit yourself primarily to the pursuit of God. Seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. Be married and embrace the children that God wishes to give you, and then fashion your professional life as a support for that, not vice versa. It's a vain quest to seek human fulfillment in professional ambitions to the neglect of your spiritual ambitions and marriage and family life. That's an exchange that produces very, very bad results. May the witness of Christians and their faithful reception of God's gift of children be a solution to the baby bust in which we live. Christ is risen.